So this segment, we will continue our discussion of the 5 more contemporary approaches to leadership, models of leadership. In this segment, we'll talk about followership. And followership is really a 20th century focus of leadership studies into the 21st century. It is an ethics-oriented leadership model. So those ethical models will be very significant in the notion of followership. And followers really have an important role in reminding leaders of the core ethical principles, and they can, in many cases, refuse to follow leaders who blatantly disregard ethics. So the accountability piece to leadership is really strong in this followership belief. So leaders really one of the major components, as we talked about followers before, is the capacity to remind and refuse. Sometimes transforms followers from passive yes people to more active partners in organizational success. So it's important as we look at this to look at some of the early examples of followership, and Mary Parker Follett did some of the early work on this in her emphasis that both management and labor shared common concerns. And so she developed a power model for leaders that became popular in the early retail industry in the 20th century. So the idea that there's a coactive, not coercive sense of relationships between leader and employee. In fact, she was the one that began to use the word associates that places like Walmart use today. In the post-World War II era, the whole idea of followership as a discipline became widely studied in response to the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were the war crime trials of the Nazis, and many people, including the reading that we did by Hannah Arendt on Adolf Eichmann, which we will discuss at length in class, really talked about their intrigue in following orders and why people followed the Nazis, and the claims that Eichmann and others made in these trials that they were following orders and that was their defense, and they're not responsible for their actions because they did not give the order. They simply were following the lead of the organization, in this case, the Nazi Party and the government. And so Nuremberg Principle 4, this concept that following an order of the government or a superior does not relieve an individual from the responsibility under international law. And so they were held accountable for making decisions, even though their defense was that they were following their orders and there were consequences for not following orders. The argument of the Nuremberg court was that they had a moral choice, and that was still possible, and it was made by the individual in this case and not the government. Stanley Milgram became interested in this and explored the Nuremberg defense of Nazi followers and this notion of how much harm is a person willing to do to another person in the name of obedience and authority. He did these education experiments that where he asked participants and a researcher to administer electric shock to learners every time the learner answered something incorrectly. And the shocks increased as each wrong answer increased. And so the learner, of course, was an actor pretending to experience shocks, and the research participant, in many cases, they begged and acted and begged the participants to stop, and the participants continued to follow authority. And so his experiments showed that people will follow authority. They will just blindly follow in a lot of cases. And James Mindel also advocated a concept called group contagion theory, in which a group determines what the leader is and begins to take the leader out of the equation. And so this began really work in a different vein of followership, not just the blind authority, but actually followers and the work that you can train followers to do. Robert Kelly wrote an article in Harvard Business Review called In Praise of Followers, one of the readings in this course that we did. And he exemplified the power of followership and how followers highly committed to the mission of the organization could be powerful contributors. Followers could also be highly destructive as we've seen from the research in these experiments. So courageous followers are necessary to keep organizations ethical. This idea was further developed by Ira Chilliff and the effective followers in the roles of an organization. Barbara Kellerman also initiated the concept of intelligent disobedience, and again, the opposite of the Nuremberg trials, how followerships or how followers have the ability to change organizations successfully, particularly holding leaders accountable. Kellerman advanced the followership paradox, the idea that followers may be acting more and sometimes they act alone, sometimes uncoordinated, and not always effectively. So there still is this notion of followership being potentially good, but also things can go wrong, as we saw in the play The Enemy of the People by Arthur Miller. So ineffective followers make it easy to see why leaders can remain in place no matter how inadequate they are. And so let's look at a few concepts of followership. First of all, it's important to note that one concept is that followers are really not so different than leaders. It's an active model, particularly in our age of knowledge, of information. Followers are more empowered. People have more information. They know more. And the roles have become more mutable. In other words, some people may play both roles, as we saw in The Enemy of the People. We saw the role of leader and follower interchangeable between certain people in the plays. And so looking at these as roles instead of permanent conditions, I think, is an important concept in looking at how followers are not so different than leaders. They actually need to learn to think like a leader, and that's part of what the training is espousing in corporations, is teaching followers how to think like leaders. Active followers, the next concept is the idea that active followers are empowered followers, and this notion that we see with Kelly and with Chilliff and with Kellerman, these different typologies, and you see several examples in these three. Organizing factors are different in some cases. Some really focus on the degree of the active nature versus the passive nature of followers. Kelly talked about the independence or dependence in their thinking. Chilliff talked about how the degree of challenge to the leader, whether they were actively challenging the leader or passive as far as the leader was concerned. And Kellerman talked about the degree of engagement in the followership process, how some leaders on her continuum were basically bystanders and some were diehards. So these typologies really demonstrate that, as you can see from the charts there, looking at all three of those, in this case looking at Kelly, how these typologies demonstrate that leadership cannot be lumped into one category, and followership therefore also cannot be lumped into one category as a passive bundle of people or as a tribe. The next concept is the idea of followers as moral agents, and this is a very important concept of followership because of Principle 4 in the Nuremberg trials, that followers really are morally culpable for their actions, and this notion of the courageous follower and holding leaders accountable, but also followers are accountable. This was not lost on the ancients. The Greek word for scapegoat, pharmakos, is translated both as poison and cure. And so followers play an important role in whistleblowers, but also they pay a price for that. Half to 2/3 of them lose their jobs. But active followers do have the capability of responding to toxic leaders and changing organizations, and they have the ability to identify and correct issues with toxic leadership and serve as a check to inappropriate behavior. This typically happens from the engaged followers. The yes people tend to support poor leaders. But the greatest outcome of good followers is holding leaders accountable. And of course, healthy followership is vital to empower good leaders and resist bad ones. So let's look at the critiques. There are a couple of critiques of followership. First of all, the limits of language. The term follower connotates the passive role. You look back at the early work of people like Follett, where she used the word associate, partner, stakeholder, constituent, participant, team, maybe more positive in its connotation of what we really mean when we say true followership or healthy followership. The other, of course, critique of followership is the hierarchical nature of organizations. It's a challenge to followership. The positional power is based on the organizational structure, and it's really up to the leader to empower the follower, because the hierarchy and the overall model of the organization typically doesn't necessarily always do that. And the last major critique is really that there are risks for both followers and leaders in using followership as a focus and a focal point and a model for leadership. Obviously, followers could risk their job or their position in the organization, those that are whistleblowers, but also they can simply get on the bad side of a leader for being too outspoken and trying to take healthy followership to maybe the wrong level. But there are also risks to leaders. Many leaders fear ceding this power. They see followers as a threat, and they don't fully. Really, in many cases, maybe it's too late before they fully understand how healthy followers can be utilized to their benefit in an organization. So for followership to work, both leaders and followers will take risks. Looking at this in the context of the 5 components model, both the follower and the leader circles are important. Obviously, the follower circle is really critical. Followership reminds us that followers have a choice to resist the leader or support the leader. The enemy of the people play really shows these choices and the typologies that followers have in supporting or resisting leadership. And in most cases, healthy followership resists either extremes of the continuum, the extreme of being too passive and not engaged at all versus the diehard that's willing to die literally for those beliefs. The values of the organization are also typically more important with followership than goals are, because followers in many cases will really be the ones that are the real strong voice for values and ethics in an organization, oftentimes, if leaders step out of bounds. Context is powerful as well, and it's often what compels leaders to make unethical decisions, and sometimes it causes followers to become yes people rather than yielding to pressure, or maybe it causes them to yield to the pressure from the leader. So all these components, but certainly followership is a component that is worth paying attention to in our modern context.